Israel sometimes uses airstrikes and military means to take out buildings and sites within other countries, such as the nuclear reactor in Iraq and Palestinian Liberation Organization buildings in Tunisia and Lebanon. Why would neighboring countries trust Israel when it is willing to violate borders and sovereignty by sending its military across?
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so I will answer your question. I'm just going to introduce myself, if that's okay, for 2 minutes. It's okay, if that's okay. I'll introduce myself, give you a bit of background, and then I will answer your question, okay? Because you'll spot if I don't, I'll just say who I am. Okay, so my name's Michael Freeman. I am a diplomat at the Israeli embassy. You will have picked up by now that my accent's not the typical Israeli accent. I was born in England. I grew up here. I went to school here. I went to university in Manchester, and then I moved to Israel about 20 years ago, did my second degree, joined the Foreign Service, and previously was posted at the United Nations. I was the Deputy Ambassador in South Africa, and now I've been sent to London. I'm married, I have a couple of kids. That is the basic introduction into me. And what the other thing is, I actually quite like this format. What do I mean by that? Because I'd very much like to try and have a conversation, like ask questions and have a conversation, rather than be in some place where I stand up and talk and you don't actually get to really engage. Because I think the issues that we're dealing with are not black and white. I think there's a lot of grey. And I think that often you end up in debates. I'll sit here, someone will sit there, and we have to entrench into kind of positions without really being able to discuss nuance and really be able to discuss some of those areas. So I welcome the opportunity. I thank you for having me. And on that, I will get and answer your question, which I remember, but you may need to, if I don't get it all, you'll remind me. So, look, Israel as a country is absolutely within its rights, both legally and morally, to defend itself against those people, countries, and organizations that are looking to cause our civilians and looking to cause our country harm. If a country, and you use the example of Iraq, Iraq under Saddam Hussein was building a nuclear reactor for the express purposes of building a nuclear bomb in order to carry out, at some point, an attack on Israel. And we were proven right, by the way, in that, because if you remember, you won't remember, but in the Gulf War in 1991, okay, Iraq invaded Kuwait, took over Kuwait. The rest of the world said, please leave Kuwait. Iraq didn't leave Kuwait. The world launched, and the world launched an operation a military operation in order to remove Iraq from Kuwait. It had invaded an absolutely independent country for no reason other than to take the oil, and the world said, you've got to get out. The United Nations backed it, and the world said, you've got to get out. They didn't get out. They gave them a deadline. They passed the deadline, and the world launched a military strike led by Britain and America into Iraq in order to get Iraq out of Kuwait, into Kuwait. The response from Iraq was to fire missiles onto Israeli cities. Okay? Israel was not involved in this conflict in any way whatsoever. They weren't a part of Kuwait. They weren't in Kuwait. They weren't a part of the coalition. Yet the response of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was to fire rockets and missiles into Israel. If those missiles would have been nuclear armed, I don't need to explain to you what the implications of that were. So Israel understood that here was a country building a nuclear reactor in order to build nuclear weapons with the expressed interest of attacking Israel. And Israel took action in order to destroy that nuclear power plant, or not a nuclear core, before it went live, before it went hot, before the fuel rods were in, without causing any damage to anybody else, and the Iraqis never then rebuilt that centre. The reality is this, that if you are running a country, and you are living in a country, and you are facing a threat, and a real threat, from a country or a terror organisation who has expressed clear aim to destroy and to kill your people, and has shown in the past they will do that, then I think every country not only has a legal duty, but has an absolute moral duty to its own people to act in order to carry out, to stop those things from happening.
Again, I apologise for skipping the introduction.
That's okay.
A little ahead of myself there. Yeah, do we have any responses to my responses there? Absolutely.
Okay, I can definitely understand the situation in Iraq. There's also the situation in Lebanon and Tunisia. So specifically in Tunisia, I believe Israel bombed a building which was thought to be a Palestinian Liberation Organization base. And I believe that was in response to some of its members taking hostage some Israeli citizens. The issue is that it was done without consent from Tunisia, and as a result, it led to a spark in anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish people within the country. And so I was just wondering, Israel wants to defend its citizens, but it also says it's a Jewish state. So I imagine that protecting Jewish people worldwide or not inflaming tensions would also be an interest of the country.
Look, let's understand at the time who the PLO were. This wasn't just a random building in Tunis. This was the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. This is where Yasser Arafat was. This is where the leadership was. These were the people who were regularly planning and carrying out terrorist attacks, not only, by the way, against Israel, but also against Jews. They would carry out indiscriminately. These were the people who invented airline hijackings. These were the people who blew up planes on the ground. These were the people who took in Entebbe. They hijacked the plane in Entebbe, the Air France plane, and separated off the Jews and the Israelis from everybody else. They released the rest of the passengers and kept the Jews and the Israelis had to send a commando force to release them. These are the people who carried out numerous terror attacks across Europe, across the world. And as you said, this was in response to an attack that was taking place by Palestinian terrorists on Israeli citizens in the weeks and months before. Immediately, but many other attacks. And Israel was looking for a way. And by the way, I think that what Israel was dealing with 30 years ago, 40 years ago, are also questions that many democracies are dealing with today, which is, how do you fight terrorism? Okay, I'll give you an example. If you are, and you can give criticism if you like, but there needs to be a serious discussion. When America decided to take out Osama bin Laden, they didn't ask Pakistan for permission because they were worried it was going to give some sort of warning to bin Laden, and therefore they needed to act by themselves. When Britain and America are looking to take out terrorists in Afghanistan, they don't necessarily ask the Afghans for permission to do that. But they act in order to protect their citizens around the world, and they do so because they believe that's the best interest. Now, there was definitely, after the attack on Osama bin Laden, after Osama bin Laden was killed, there was a short wave in Pakistan of anti-American feeling. Does that mean the Americans were wrong to take out Osama bin Laden, to try and arrest him and therefore have to kill him, but afterwards there was a wave of anti-American feeling? No, because objectively Americans are safer now that Osama bin Laden was taken out as the head of Al-Qaeda. Yes, there were protests. So in answer to your question, yes, there were protests. And again, I would say to you that because Israel takes an action, the Jews who are living in Tunisia and the Jews who live in parts are not citizens of the state of Israel. Yes, we are a Jewish country. Yes, Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people, but that doesn't mean that a Jew who lives in Britain is a British citizen and is Jewish, is an Israeli citizen. No, they are a British citizen who is Jewish, who is living in Britain. And so I think we have to make that difference. And just because Israel does something, it doesn't justify giving the right to anybody to attack the local Jewish community. And at the same time, Israel needs to act in what it believes and what we believe to be our long-term aims and our long-term goals in order to secure our people.
Thank you. Any other comments on anything the speaker has said so far?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting your language that you're using in terms of Palestinian terrorist attacks and defending Israel as a country. I think there seems to be quite an imbalance. I don't think Palestinian Jerusalem, I think it's very unfair to label Palestinians as terrorists and Israel as defenders of their country. I think the language you're using is quite problematic.
Okay.
And yeah, that's my first
Look,
thing.
you've raised lots and lots of issues in there, and I'm not going to go into all of them. We can go into some of those other issues if we want afterwards, Jerusalem embassy and stuff like that. But I do want to tackle that one question that the fundamental one here. Look, I'm not talking about all of the Palestinian people. I'm not saying to here the Palestinian people are bad. I'm not saying that all Palestinians are terrorists. I'm not saying that, and if that's what you're hearing, then please, that's not my message. And I'm very clearly not saying that. What I am saying is that there are very clear Palestinian terrorists within Palestinian society. In the case of Gaza, these people are running Gaza. Hamas is a radical Islamist terror organization that states very, very clearly that they are interested in destroying Israel. Today, in the last 2.5 hours, and you should understand this, over 250 rockets have been fired by Hamas into Israel. Okay? Now, I know this because I'm seeing it on the news, but you should also know, if we want to talk about the personal stories, that my wife's from a town called Ashkelon. Her parents are elderly, they're sick, they're in their house at the moment, they have no bomb shelter, because it's an old house, there's no bomb shelter, and 45 minutes ago, a rocket landed on a house down the road from them, and it could have been their house. Okay, so let's not pretend that anybody's fighting with sticks and stones here. Okay, when you're firing a rocket that has a range of 100 kilometers, that has explosives in the end of it, that you're manufacturing, you're receiving them from Iran, and you're receiving both the funding and the rockets from Iran, and you're firing them, those aren't sticks or stones. When you talk about cutting water off, that's just not true. It's just not true. Israel has never cut the water off to Gaza. Not only has Israel never cut the water off to Gaza, Israel in the last, and I'm sure if you're following this, you know this, in the last 2 weeks has increased the amount of electricity being provided by Gaza because Hamas, who have been cutting it off, and the Palestinian Authority have been cutting off, they had only 4 hours a day, they're now up to 12 hours a day because we are providing extra fuel and we're providing extra ways of in for them. And if you want to check, have a look at the desalination plant that was built by the United Nations and Hamas refused to allow to come online. So I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you that says, what's the way forward, where do we go? But I think we also need to be very, very honest with ourselves here. Hamas is a radical terror organization. They are in control of the Gaza Strip. Their express desire is for the state of Israel to be destroyed and every Jew everywhere to be killed. And that's not my words. Go to the Hamas website. Look up, when you have a second, look online for the Hamas constitution. They are very clear about what they say. They're not pretending. They don't try and hide it. Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in Gaza, said a month ago, our aim is we are going to tear down the fence, talking about the fence between Gaza and Israel. We will go inside and we will rip their hearts out. Okay, this is what they are. Now, the vast majority of the people living in Gaza are absolutely held prisoner by this radical Islamist terror organization. Hamas is firing rockets, they're carrying out terror attacks, they're carrying out all of those things. So I'm willing to have a conversation about where the future is. But I think if you try and project a group of people who are firing rockets, 250 in 3 hours, and every single one of them, by the way, is aimed at civilian targets. This afternoon they fired an anti-tank missile into a civilian bus driving down the street. Aimed at it. Aimed at the bus, they fired into a bus and blew a bus up. Fortunately, the people who were on the bus had got off the bus 5 minutes earlier. There is one person who's currently fighting for his life, but only one person was injured as opposed to the 50 people who were on it 5 minutes earlier. So if we're going to have a conversation, let's have a conversation. But let's not pretend that these people on the other side are poor people throwing stones and wear some big monstrous armour. We're people who are living in our house, in our homes, and want to defend ourselves. And I'll finish up with this point. Everybody says to us, and said to Israel 15 years ago, you know, the big problem is that you're occupying the Palestinian people. The big problem is you're not letting them live. The big problem is all of these settlements you've got. So Israel, we came forward, and under Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister, he said, if that's the case, let's look at Gaza. Gaza, a small strip in the south of, in the southern part. There were 9,000 Jewish Israelis living there. There were a number of what are referred to internationally as settlements. And Israel took down every single one of those settlements, took out all 9,000 of the settlers, moved back to the international 1967 borders that everybody talks about. If the issue was settlements, if the issue was occupation, if the issue was 1967 borders, in theory, after that, we should have had peace. That should be our most peaceful border. No settlers, no settlements, 1967 borders, allowed to bring anything in they wanted to, allowed to do anything they wanted. When we left greenhouses, we left structures, we left things there for them. Should be the most peaceful border. The reality is, since then, tens of thousands of rockets, suicide bombers, and other things have come across from that Gaza border. It would appear that the issue is not any of those things. The issue is our existence.
Last one.
Do you not think the best way to counter terrorism is to not use disproportionate tactics? Almost all rockets you spoke about that fired into Israel are intercepted, and yet in 2014 Israel decided to incinerate Gaza, killing over 2,000 civilians. And you can say things like, oh, they put civilians near like strategic bases that we need to bomb. It was pretty intentional, the complete destruction of Gaza. The March of Return protest recently also touched on another thing you mentioned. It's hard to pretend that the kind of weapons they had at the March of Return protest posed a serious threat to such to like a state like Israel. It didn't pose a serious security threat. You still chose to use disproportionate tactics to shoot people and maim people. The number of people that died are irrelevant. Some of the weapons Israel uses in terms of the types of bullets rip into people and maim people. There's no need for those kind of weapons. I think it's a complete folly to pretend that this isn't disproportionate, and that's how you create more terrorism, by using disproportionate tactics.
Okay. So you covered a couple of things. You covered three major things, and I'm happy to answer all of them. First of all, 2014, the Gaza conflict. We need to remember how in the Gaza conflict. First of all, you said, they've got lots of rockets, and those rockets are not killing many Israelis because we're shooting them down. That may be true, but war has never been based on whether or not the other side is successful in killing your people or not. Okay? As a country, Israel spends millions, actually billions, in air raid shelters, in a system called the Iron Dome, which literally is a rocket that shoots rockets out of the sky. It's an anti-missile system. It spends millions on other defences, on various air raid systems, on various other ways to protect its civilians. Hamas spends millions on developing terror tunnels, on developing rockets. It does not invest anything in civilian infrastructure in terms of hospitals. They haven't built a single hospital. They haven't built a single school.
You block their building resources.
Hang on a second. Well, first of all, that's not true. That's not true, and I'm happy to give you the dates and specifics, but let me come on to this. Hamas have not built anything. Okay? In 2014, okay, I don't accept those figures of the people that were killed. And I'll tell you why. Okay? Of the 2,000 people that you claim were, of the 2,000 people that were claimed to be killed, all of those figures come directly from Hamas. That's the first thing. All of those figures come directly from Hamas. Let's assume they're true. Okay? And let's assume that your next thing that you say is all 2,000 were killed. And more than that all those people, okay, Hamas is as you said, is a very, very densely populated place. If we were shooting indiscriminately, you would assume that of the 2,000 people, 50% would be male, 50% would be female. Fair enough assumption? If we're shooting indiscriminately. If we're shooting indiscriminately, 50% should be male, 50% should be female. If we're shooting indiscriminately, there should be an average breakdown of age that reflects the average breakdown of age of the society. It should be a certain age group, there should be a certain number of old people, a certain number of people between 40 and 60, a certain number of people between 20 and 40, and between 0 and 20. Yet when you look at the numbers of the people who were killed, over 70% are male between the ages of 16 and 30. That doesn't make any sense if this is indiscriminate civilians. It doesn't work. The numbers don't work. What's much more likely is that these were actually not civilians, but rather Hamas terrorists or Hamas fighters who were disguised and dressing themselves in civilians or were claimed as civilians afterwards. That's a much more likely rational response and a rational explanation to the breakdown of the people that were killed. That's the first thing to say when we talk about some of these numbers. You say we claim that they're hiding behind civilians. Well, actually, the United Nations talked about 3 occasions where they had to evacuate schools because they found their rockets underneath the United Nations schools that were actually being used by the schools to store the rockets. Okay? We have seen multiple examples of journalists and others saying we saw the rocket being fired from the house. The command and control centre of Hamas. Why was no one from Hamas's leadership killed in the 2014 campaign? Because they were all in the Al-Waqf hospital. They were all in the hospital. Their command and control bunker was underneath the hospital because they knew that Israel would never target the hospital deliberately when there was patients in there. And therefore, they put their entire command and control centre in the hospital. Again, do a search on it. On the Washington Post, I believe it was, ran a whole article about their command and control centre being underneath the hospital. Okay, so that's again, in terms of where we're looking at. And I'll ask you a serious, genuine moral dilemma. A serious, genuine moral dilemma. And I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm going to leave it for you. You are an Israeli commander who is in charge of the army. There's a house. In that house, there's 3 rooms. 2 of the rooms a family are living in, a husband, wife, and probably 8 or 9 kids. In the 3rd room, or in the basement, Hamas, because of the way they control Gaza, have forced this family to store 10 rockets. Family don't want to, but they need to do that because if their father wants a job, if their children want to go to the local kindergarten, if they want to get their food supplies, they need to have the rockets in that house. They have to do that. That's one of the conditions. The rockets are in the house. And during the conflict, Hamas operatives come, they take the rocket, they fire it from the roof of that house. And they fire it into Israeli civilian populations. The aim is at my in-laws in Ashkelon. Is that house a military target or is it a civilian target? Okay? It's a serious moral dilemma, and I'm not going to give you the answer because I don't know that there is a direct answer. By the way, in war, in international war, there's a very clear answer, which is that's a military target. But in today's world, is that house a military target or is it a civilian target? Is it right, and again, your responsibility as a leader is primarily to your own citizens. If that rocket that's firing lands in a house and kills a child, or kills an elderly couple, or whoever else it kills, and therefore the war goes on, or whatever else, but you could have blown up that house and maybe you would have killed the husband and wife and 2 of the children to stop that rocket being fired, is that a legitimate response as you as the leader of Israel? I'm not asking you from another perspective. What should your response be when the rockets are being fired from off the roof? But they're being fired off the roof of a civilian house. And you're facing that question every single day, dozens of times a day. Okay, it's a serious moral. And if you say to me, it's very easy, then I don't believe you're really wrestling with that moral dilemma. And that's the moral dilemma when you start to come up to it, when you start to deal with it. So I think when you start to say, these are some of the issues. The other issue there, and I'll go in there, is this issue of proportionality. Proportionality as a law and as a part of the international law, proportionality is proportional to the threat you are facing. It is not proportional to what you're doing. Because if, by the way, if according to international law, if according to that definition of proportionality, Israel should respond in the same way of Hamas, then the way Israel should respond to the 250 rockets that were fired in the last 3 hours, we should fire 250 rockets randomly into the Gaza Strip, aiming for civilian populations. That's how we should respond if we're going to respond exactly the same way that they did. fire randomly 250 rockets into civilian populations. No one would say that's a proportionate response, because it's not, but you have to be proportionate to the threat you're facing. So if you target weapons warehouses, if you target the leaders of Hamas, if you target their supply and control centres, and even if you do use it with planes and you use other things, that is a proportionate response to the threat that you are facing, not to the actions they're taking. Because the fact that we can shoot down rockets in the air when they're being fired at us doesn't make those rockets any less deadly or any less dangerous or any more of a threat. Because as we've seen today, a house in Ashkelon got hit, a house in Netivot got killed, only the dog was killed because it happened to be in the wrong room at the right time. Okay, a bus was targeted which was blown up, and 3 other houses were injured, and 12 people are currently in hospital. Okay, now 12 people is not a lot for 250 rockets, you'll say. Well, if they're one of your 12, though one of those 12 is your family, that is. So I don't think that anything is so black and white. I think it's much greyer, and it's much more difficult to say, this is bad, this is... But the reality is this about Hamas. Hamas do hide behind civilians. That's how they operate. They hide, they fire from on top of houses, they fire from schoolyards, they fire from hospitals. That's how they operate, that's who they are. And you talked about the so-called Great Return March. The Great Return March is nothing of the sort. Okay? This is a propaganda attempt by Hamas to march people to the border. Let's be very clear here. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip completely. You don't do anything in the Gaza Strip if Hamas don't want you to. Nothing. If you want to protest, enjoy. If you in Gaza want to protest, our message is, please protest. We are a democracy, we are a liberal democracy, guaranteed the freedom of vote, freedom of independent judiciary, freedom of gathering, freedom of expression, all of those things. Hamas doesn't. That's the irony here. So when they bring people to the border, they're only coming to the border if Hamas has brought them there. They don't get there spontaneously. Hamas bring them to the border. And when they come to the border, they give them very clear instructions on what to do. They hand out leaflets on where to go and how to run towards the border. And in fact, Hamas pay people based on how far they run towards the border and what their injury are. You get money. You pay to slay. If you kill an Israeli, you get more than if you injure an Israeli. If you get to the border, you get a certain amount. If you breach the border, you get a certain amount more. Again, don't take my word for it. Have a look at some of the journalists. I think Rafi Sanchez from The Telegraph ran a whole piece about this. These are well-documented things about how people are paid to carry these things out. They're also told, and I'll finish with this, on their Facebook pages, very clear instructions. Take with you guns, take with you explosives, take with you wire cutters, but hide them. Don't let anyone see you. Don't let anyone see the guns. We've got recorded, it's a shame I didn't win it, because I could have brought you very clear recorded evidence of people breaching the fence with explosives, of them breaching the fence with guns, of them shooting, of carrying out attacks inside there. So it's very easy to say this is what it is, this is what it is. The reality is much more complex, much more difficult. Now, and I will say this last piece, are there times that Israel as a country and individuals within the army have overreacted, have done things that aren't necessarily done in the right way? Have we made mistakes? Have innocent civilians been killed? Because when you're in a war, there's no war where innocent civilians don't die, even if you're doing everything you can to stop it. Yes. Am I utterly sorry about every single one of those innocent civilians who's died? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think we need to understand some of the grey here. This is not black and white in any way whatsoever.
Thank you. If you do have a point on anything that's just been said, please try your hardest to remember it for the open Q&A, but we are now going to move on to the next question for discussion, which I believe is from Carsten.
So there's a lot of discussion in many countries, including the UK, regarding anti-Semitism. In what ways do you feel the issue of Israel and anti-Semitism are linked in the media? And do you feel Israel should do more to improve its example or its image to its neighbours and to the world?
Okay. So, I don't want to talk about anti-Semitism specifically, because I'm a representative of the Israeli government. I'm not a representative of the British Jewish community here. And the British Jewish community have got very able and very good representatives and very strong representatives, and they will talk about what it's like to be a British Jew. I will talk to you about what it's like to be an Israeli. And I think the one area where I think there are questions that need to be asked is as follows. If you say that you accept the right of every single people to national self-determination, everybody has the right to define themselves as a people. And every people that define themselves has the right to self-determination. And you extend that right to every single country. You say, do you know what? The English, they're a nation, they have some form of self-determination. I get it. The Americans, they have a right to self-determination. The Kurds, they have the right to self-determination. The Iraqi people, they have the right to self-determination. But when it comes to the Jews, you have an issue with that. That's where I think you're starting to cross that line. So if you say, look, the Jews have got, I recognize the Jews are a people, maybe. If you don't recognize the Jews as a people, I think that's problematic. And I think if you don't recognize that the Jews have the right to self-determination in their own homeland, then I think that's also problematic. So I think those are those images. And in the that's where I think it's problematic. What I don't think is legitimate, and I think is deeply problematic, is to say Israel's doing A, B, or C, that's going to cause an increase in anti-Semitism. Israel's doing this or that, no wonder why people are being nasty to Jews. Because the two things are not connected in any way whatsoever. Okay? Israel is an independent country that, yes, is the Jewish homeland, but that doesn't mean that a Jew in Britain is any more responsible for what we do as a country than I am for what they do in Britain. Okay? So I think they're two separate subjects, but are obviously closely linked, and so the short answer would be, I think if you deny Israel's right to exist as an independent country for the Jewish people, then that has gone into anti-Semitism. And I think if you blame Jews for things that Israel is doing, that's also an anti-Semitism.
Does anyone have any points on that and the anti-Semitism?
On many occasions, Israel has actually used anti-Semitism to defend its actions, and according to the new definition of the Holocaust Memorial, new definition has come out, a lot of what you can say about Israel is now considered anti-Semitic, because obviously Israel is a Jewish state, namely. So what you say there is actually quite limited now. So how can you criticize Israel while separating from anti-Semitism if Israel is just going to claim that what you're saying is anti-Semitic?
So let me be very clear. Be really clear here. Criticism of Israel, absolutely fine. If you want to find the harshest critics of Israel, come to Israel. They're the harshest critics you'll find of Israel, about government policy, about what government's doing, about what's going on, about all the other issues that are happening. Harshest critics in the world are in Israel. Really. You've got a criticism of Israel, of government policy, of what we're doing, of where we are. Carry on, criticize all day long. Genuinely, I mean that. However, if you get to the point and say, Israel has no right to exist, that's where it's problematic. Okay? If you say Israel therefore has no right to exist, okay, then you're getting to a point whereby that's where you've crossed the line. Okay? So you can say anything you like about the country, you can say anything you like about what's going on, but you don't have the right, I believe, to say Israel should not exist. And I'll give you a great example. During the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, with Tony Blair and that's held up, thousands of people marched through the streets, right? Criticizing. What was their march? Their march was, get rid of Tony Blair. This guy's a war criminal, whatever. I'm not giving you my opinion of what, this is what they were saying. And they said the policy in Iraq was so bad that what we have to do is get rid of Tony Blair. Okay? When you're marching in the street and you're putting stuff out, what you're actually saying here is not I don't like Netanyahu, it's I don't believe that Israel should exist. That's a very big difference. You want to tell me that Netanyahu is a terrible prime minister, that you want to get rid of him, that you think Israel is taking the most terrible pathway it's going, and therefore, for its own sake, it needs to change the government? I'll find you millions of Israelis who will agree with you. If you then go on and say, and therefore, because of what Netanyahu is doing, we should dismantle Israel, that's crossed the line, because you would never say, I disagree with Donald Trump. All those critics of Donald Trump, not one of them is standing up and saying, and therefore the answer is to get rid of America. Yet when you criticize Israeli policy, your next step is, let's get rid of Israel. Criticize Israel all day long, please. Okay? If, on the other hand, and this is the other piece I would say is, if you're going to criticize Israel in an absurd way, in a ridiculous way, in a way that doesn't hold any weight whatsoever, so if you're going to stand up and say Israel's apartheid, and it doesn't hold any weight whatsoever, and I'm happy to go through why in a minute, that's also deeply problematic. Don't lie. Don't make up things. Don't say classic themes that have been there, okay? It's just not a realistic thing. So I'm saying criticize all day long, but in no way, and the definition is very clear, criticize all day, just don't call for my country to be wiped off the map in a way you would never do for anybody else.
Thank you. We have one more on that, please.
So I liked the way that you mentioned national self-determination, because I wanted to bring up a law that was passed in the Israeli government in July this year, called the
Nation State Law,
which so it mentioned three key things, I think. And the first one was, and it says here, the national self-determination of Jewish citizens.
The right to national self-determination in Israel shall only be by Jewish citizens.
Yeah. And then the second one was about not the removal of the Arabic language in Israel, but it was the declaring that only Hebrew was the national language in Israel, despite.
So that's not exactly what it said.
I know, but I didn't write down exactly what it said, but the general gist was like, in institutions, they had to bring up laws which could remove Arabic or put Arabic in as a language in the institution in Israel. And then the last one was to do with the original attempt in the law was to say to attempt to segregate communities, but was then altered to say it now advances Jewish-only communities.
Okay.
And I wanted to just ask, especially with what Avi Dicta said, the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee chairman. He said, "We were here for you, and will be here after you." That is a quote. I just wanted to know how do you believe that this kind of response is a good response to the things that I don't agree with stuff that Hamas does. I don't think that they treat Palestinians as equal citizens, just as IDF sometimes treat citizens in their own country, as Israel does. But how do you think this is a good response to things that have happened?
Look, it's a good question. Let me give some background. One of the things I realised I haven't done is given a two-sentence background in terms of Israel, which I think sometimes we don't know. So first of all, Israel as a country, you should just know, in terms of its size, okay, is it comparable? Does anyone know the comparable size? By the way, it's the same size as Wales, okay? Which I think often surprises people when they're like, really? That's it? Well, it's the same size as Wales. It's a population of just under 9 million people, okay, of which 20% of the population is Arab and 80% of the population is Jewish. Okay, that's just, I think it's useful to give those pieces, because a lot of people don't know that. Okay, it's a Western liberal democracy in a political philosophical sense of that. In that every single citizen, Arab, Jew, Cherkessim, Druze, whatever they may be, they have full rights in the law and in practice in what's going on. The other thing is that Israel is also only 70 years old. It was founded in 1948. It doesn't have a constitution. This is where I'm getting to your point now. So when it doesn't have a constitution, we have a Declaration of Independence, but lots of things aren't written down. Now, Britain also doesn't have a constitution, but it's a bit older than 70 years. Okay, and even now, Britain's got various issues that it hasn't quite worked out exactly what that means and what it isn't, and there's arguments about what does it mean to be British and what's Britishness. So there was an attempt to try and say, let's put down in the law some of the most basic things, and I would encourage all of you to read it. You can get it. It's one side of A4 paper. Okay, that's the length of the law, and you can read it in English. And the vast majority of the law does really simple, silly things that you would say you know. So, for example, it would say the country's called Israel. It says it has a flag with 2 blue stripes and a Star of David in the middle that will also be blue on a white background. It says the national anthem shall be called Hatikva, which is the name of the national anthem. It says all sorts of basic things like that because these things have never been laid down in law. It also does have 1 or 2 clauses that were very controversial. The 2 clauses, one of them is about Arabic, one of them is about Hebrew. It says that Hebrew, and this is the wording, and if anyone can understand it, please tell me. Okay, the wording says, Hebrew will be the national language of Israel. That is, it will not affect the current status of any other language. Arabic is a core language, is a national language of Israel. So what this says is Hebrew is going to be the national language, but it won't affect the status of Arabic, which is also a national language. And actually, the law's just been changed in the last 2 years, and I might have got this wrong, the last 2 years, that says Arabic will now be taught in every single school, in high school. So every Jewish pupil has to learn Arabic as part of their schooling. If you go to Israel, every sign is in Hebrew and in Arabic, and it will remain to be so. It is still a national language. So no one is genuinely quite sure of exactly what the law does and how it affects it. Because on a day-to-day it doesn't change the status of Arabic, it just makes Hebrew a bit higher, I suppose. But no one... The one that caused controversy, which I don't think is controversial, said that only the Jewish people have the right to self-determination in the land of Israel. Okay? In England, the only people who have the right to self-determination are the English. In Spain, the only people who have the right to self-determination are the Spanish. Okay? And by the way, there are many, many other countries that have a similar law. Many, many other countries that have a similar law. The reality is this, that Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people. And this law says that the people who will realise their self-determination doesn't say they won't have full and equal rights, doesn't say they won't be a democracy, doesn't say they can't have all those. And if you read the nation-state law by itself, then, and you said this is the only law that Israel's got, we are now going to show you these are the laws of Israel, this is it, 1 page. Then you're right, there's problems there. If you say, but hang on a minute, this is read alongside the law of equal rights for every citizen, this is read alongside the law of etc., 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 and you get all of the laws together, then it makes a much more logical picture. And the reality is that the rights of the individual and the rights of democracy are enshrined in law, in basic laws that can't be changed without a 2/3 majority in the Israeli parliament. They're basic laws that can't be changed. Now, with all of that said, it caused controversy in Israel. There were people within the country who criticised the law. Okay, I'm a representative of the State of Israel, I'm representing the government of Israel. I will tell you why I think the law is correct. I will also tell you that there was a significant proportion, whether that's 10%, whether that's 40%, or whether that's 50%, is not necessarily important, who had major criticisms of that law. And they expressed the criticisms of that law in public, and in demonstrations, and in articles in the press, and in a vote in the parliament, and in all sorts of different ways.
One of them being Benny
But one of them being a member of the Likud ruling party, who was the son of Menachem Begin, who was one of the most famous...
Isn't that a bit of a worry? Because he is one of the leading figures in the
Right,
Parliament.
well, he's not in the government, but look,
In Parliament.
well, I think it's not a worry, because what it shows us is exactly what some people are trying to know, which is we're a thriving democracy. That even members of your own party, the son of one of the most famous prime ministers from the right wing, would criticise that law for various reasons. Okay, so I don't think the law does what many people do. And by the way, the criticism that was given of the laws, it should have added, it wasn't that's a bad sentence, that what's in there is bad, but rather we should have added a bit more to make it explicitly clear within this law that there's full and equal rights. But yet that's, but the response was, but that's in other laws. So I really don't think that this law, and I think it was seized upon and misread and misrepresented. I don't think the law is problematic in that sense. I think it does, and it lays out lots of other things, but you cannot take it in isolation. You must take it in the context of all of the other laws of the State of Israel.
Thank you. Okay, again, if you have any questions specifically on that, please now save them for the Q&A at the end. We will now move on to our third question, which I believe is from Ebony.
Yes. Do you think the idea of a peaceful two-state two-state solution to the conflict in Israel is still a possibility? If so, what would need to happen to see it realised? And if not, like, why not? And what would have potentially needed to have happened differently?
It's a great question. So I'll answer it. There's so many bits there in that one short question. I'll try and answer them. So I think the fundamental, look, there are two peoples that want the same piece of land. Okay? The Jews, as a people, want to live in our national homeland. There is another group of people called the Palestinians who also want to live in that land. The way we're going to resolve this is through compromise. That's how we're going to resolve this issue. Okay? And I'm going to say something that will sound strange. I recognise the Palestinian desire for self-determination. I understand why they want it. I understand the historical rationale why they want it. I understand all of those things. And as an Israeli, and as the Prime Minister, my Prime Minister, I've heard him say on numerous occasions, we have no interest whatsoever in ruling over the Palestinians. None whatsoever. The Palestinians currently, and their leadership, and here we're talking about Mahmoud Abbas, who's in charge of the West Bank, doesn't recognise the Jewish right to self-determination, doesn't recognise the Jews as a people, and doesn't recognise that the Jews have the right to self-determination as in that land. He says where he calls us usurpers, he calls us foreigners, he calls us people who have no right to be there, he calls all sorts of different things. That's the literature that's going on. So what do I think that needs to happen? Firstly, I think there needs to be a fundamental shift in the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership. I think that they need to openly say, and again, this is about, I know it's, you know, you're all at university, you're all intelligent, you're going to get the nuance in language. The Palestinians will say, hey, but we've recognised Israel. Yes, you may have recognised Israel, but you haven't recognised Israel as a Jewish state. And I can recognise it, and without accepting it has a right to be there. I can recognise that chair, doesn't mean I'm not going to try and move it out of the way at some point. Okay, and it's about nuance of language. The Palestinians have always refused to recognise Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. I'm not asking them to recognise my borders. I'm not asking them to say where we should be or where we won't. But if I want to sit in a room, and when I sit in that room with the Palestinians, their answer to me is, listen, fundamentally, I don't believe you have a right to be here. What is any agreement I'm signing with them worth if they think 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line they'll be able to get rid of it because they don't believe I've got a right to be there. As soon as they recognise I have a right to be there, all of the other issues become secondary. Okay, and I go back to the very first bit we were talking about Hamas. The issue with Hamas is not the settlements, it's not the border, it's our right to be there. And how do I know that even more obviously? Because here we go, because we heard somebody shouting at me, hey, but you don't let them bring anything in you like. Anybody who knows their geography will know that Hamas as a strip has 4 sides. One side is the sea, 2 sides are land that Israel has a border, and the final side, Egypt has a border. Egypt also doesn't let stuff go in there because Hamas are in partnership with ISIS in the Sinai Desert and are passing them material and training. There has not been one missile, not one missile, fired by Hamas into Egypt. If the issue is the border controls, why has there never been a single missile into Egypt? Because Egypt has closed that border as tight as Israel has closed it. Well, maybe, just maybe, the issue isn't the border. The issue is whether or not we have a right to be here. So I think if they were to have a right to exist, then I think there's a conversation to be had. At the same time, Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I heard him say it last month when I saw him last month, said very clearly, I will negotiate with the Palestinians anytime, any place. Willing to have the negotiations. And any issue whatsoever can be on the table. So I think that the answer is, I think that there will be a historical compromise, and we know we have to make painful compromises for that. But it needs 2 sides who are willing to have that compromise. It needs 2 sides who are willing to sit down, to have negotiations and make the compromises that are needed. And the reason I say that is because I don't believe the human condition is one of wanting to be in conflict. You know, I keep mentioning the 250 missiles in the last, and it may even be way more than that now. The 250 missiles in the last 3 hours. Okay, and I will mention it because it's personal. I mentioned my wife's parents. Okay, they're also very sick at the moment, so my wife's flying out the day after tomorrow to go and be with them in their house with no shelter under all. No one in the world wants that. And I promise you that the vast majority of Palestinians who are living in Gaza don't want us to be bombing them tonight. And when I say bombing them, I don't mean we're bombing all the majority, but to be bombing people, you know, to be bombing that Hamas target that's 100 metres from them, and they might get caught up, or their kids are going to get caught up. They don't want the ruin that's being brought on them by Hamas. They just don't want it. So that's why I'm hopeful, because when I look at the leadership in the Gaza Strip, it's radical Islamist terror organisations, and I don't believe the majority of people who live there want that. All the opinion polls, by the way, say very clearly they don't want that, but they don't have elections in an Islamist radical terror organisation. So I am hopeful. I do believe there will be a compromise, because I believe the vast majority of people on both sides want to live in peace. I'm sure they do, because nobody wants to live otherwise.
Thank you. Anything more on that point from anyone? No? In which case, I think I'll ask a question.
Please do.
You were talking about like the fact that no missiles have like ever been like fired into Egypt. Firstly, do you think that like partly that might be because like Hamas are like don't want to drag like Egypt into also like bringing a response against them, and sort of like widely a lot of like the surrounding like Arab states are like relatively kind of neutral like in the conflict. Why do you think like generally that they are relatively like neutral in the conflict?
So I'm going to tell you something that's quite surprising, and this is what we haven't talked about yet. The Arab states in the region are not as neutral as you put it, as you think they are. And that's all to do with the elephant in this room that we haven't talked about, which is Iran. I don't know if there was going to be a question about Iran, but if there wasn't, I'm now going to answer the question that there hasn't been about Iran, because it relates to that. Okay, Iran, and as you'll know, there's an Iran deal that everyone talks about, the JCPOA. Okay, the Americans under President Trump withdrew from the Iran deal recently. You've heard about it, everyone's heard this. Okay, we believe that was a very good decision. This is answering your question, and that's a long way around, but it is answering your question. We believe that's a very good decision. And we believe it's a very good decision because we believe the Iran deal was fundamentally flawed. Fundamentally flawed. And it was flawed in a number of ways. Firstly, we believe it was flawed because it had what's the so-called sunset clause, that after 10 years, the deal was over and they could do what they wanted. It was also because it didn't put any restrictions on their ballistic missile capability. It also was flawed because military sites were out of the agreement. So when people could go and inspect, they couldn't inspect the military sites. And finally, the fundamental agreement was based on the fact that Iran was meant to come clear on what it was saying, and it never did. It lied. It said they were never aiming for a nuclear program. We know that's a lie. We know that's a lie because we've got the documents that prove it. So Iran has been, in the last number of years, and what was the idea of the deal? The deal was, if you get Iran enough power, and you give them enough, you release them from sanctions, that they will modify their behaviour. You stop them getting a nuclear weapon, they'll modify their behaviour, and you'll start to see a different type of Iran. Well, actually that is partly true. They have changed their behaviour. They haven't modified, they've changed it. And you do get a different type of Iran. Now you get a much more aggressive Iran. If you look at what's happening in Yemen, Iran are there. If you look at what's happening in Lebanon with Hezbollah, Iran are there. If you look at what's happening in Syria, and let's be very clear here, the Syrian conflict wouldn't have lasted as long as it lasted, it wouldn't have been as brutal as it was, and it wouldn't have ended the way it ended if it wasn't for Iran's involvement. And what's happening in Iraq, we're seeing, is also Iranian involvement. And what's happening with Hamas is Iranian involvement. Okay, Iran is involved in all of these areas, and it's using the money it's got from sanctions relief not to help its own people, but rather to build up a radical Islamist crescent in the Middle East. So we're seeing a radicalization of Iran. And what's that meant? That meant that actually it's not only Israel that's threatened by that. Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, congratulations, I'm giving you a new job. Your new job is you're going to be the emirate of a small little kingdom in the Gulf somewhere. Got its independence in the 1950s, 1960s. Okay, it was a small desert area, was really known for oil, but since then you've kind of invested, you've turned it into a holiday destination, you've turned this kingdom into a holiday destination, you've invested in sports, you've got a big airline that everybody knows, you even sponsor a football team or two around the world. You've become a really success by any stretch of the imagination. Congratulations, okay? Okay, so you've become a real, and you look around the Gulf, and you look around the Middle East, and you look around what's happening, and you try and work out what's the threat to your livelihoods. What's the biggest threat that's facing you? Israel? No. Iran? And their nuclear weapons? Yeah. Radical Islamism? Yeah. Al-Qaeda? Yeah. ISIS? Yeah. That's what's threatening you. And therefore, you have conversations and you see who your more likely allies are and the more people you're willing to talk to. And today, Israel is talking to more Arab countries than we've ever spoken to before. Okay? I'm not going to tell you who, for two reasons. One, I don't know, and if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to tell you anyway. But we're talking to more, and you've seen some of these things happening. We saw 2 weeks ago Prime Minister Netanyahu visit Oman. And it was broadcast on Omani state TV that the Prime Minister was there. We saw in Dubai, I know this sounds a small thing, we saw in Dubai the World Judo Championships, Israeli judo players able to take part under the Israeli flag. When an Israeli won a gold medal, which itself is a miracle, but when an Israeli won a gold medal, they played Hatikva, they played the national anthem, and they played it in Dubai. 5 years ago, in the swimming tournament there were people swimming and it was blocked out as to where they were. They weren't allowed to have an Israeli flag showing anywhere. And not only that, the minister went with them. So we're seeing a changing, developing world. And therefore, it's not that many of the countries are neutral. Actually, many of the countries are much more open. They're much more willing to have conversations because they recognize that Israel is a place and a country that they want to be like in terms of our economic success, our startup success, our health success, our integration, all of those things. And the people that are a threat to them are Iran and radical Islamism and other areas across there. So I think that that's much more of a very long answer as to the actual reality. And why I don't think they're firing rockets, because Hamas doesn't want to destroy Israel. It doesn't want to destroy Egypt.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think because, as with many of these things often do, all of those took more time than I expected, so I think we will probably go on to the open Q&A now. If you have any points about anything that's been said, any new points, anything you'd like to bring up, the floor.
I'll answer shorter.
Ooh, so, yeah, if anyone has a question.
My aunt is an RA teacher, and I've, questioned her a lot about what is at the core of the hatred between Israel and Palestine, I guess. I want to know, obviously aside from borders, is it something to do with the religion itself?
Wow. I'm going to give you probably the same answer your auntie gave. I don't know.
Okay.
Look, I think there are many issues. It's a really complex geopolitical issue. So I think you've got, for some people, it is a religious issue. I think for radical Islam, and again, let me be very clear here, I'm not talking about Muslims, I'm not talking about Islam, I'm talking about radical Islamism. I'm talking about the Al-Qaeda, Hamas, ISIS, that type of where I'm talking. For that small part of a warped ideology, it is about religion. It's about their sense of religion. Okay, that's a better way of putting it. It's about their sense of religion and about this being a holy Islamist caliphate that no one can be there, that's not there, and they have to take it over, and it's that's part of it. For other parts, it's about a national identity, about being there. And it really comes back to the question that the woman there asked me about what there needs to be for for that solution, for that answer. And I think part of that is to do with, look, in 1947, the United Nations offered a two-state solution. It offered a partition plan. The Jews accepted it, the Arabs rejected it. And ever since then, they've rejected any form of compromise that allows the state to exist. Why? Maybe because they believed they could win militarily at that time. Now I don't think they could believe they can win militarily, not in a serious way. So I think that the hate, a lot of that hatred that used to be there, is disappearing. I think part of it is based on a political piece, radicalism. I think there's an element of anti-Semitism there. The Jews have got no right to be here. Who are these Jews? How dare they come here? They're not a people. They've got no history, etc., etc. But I think it's also something that unfortunately has been passed down the generations. When you ask the question, why do you? Well, you just do, don't you? And I think there's also an element of that.
Very much.
So kind of balancing off the question just asked there, I suppose one could argue that while there's been a resurgence in Islam in say the past few decades, do you reckon that would be kind of a response to America's involvement in the Middle East? I mean, as Israel is a democracy, you could argue that the hegemon of the United States is like a de facto ally of Israel. And so perhaps if the United States eased its kind of like super aggressive liberal ideals, as in like democratizing the entire world for like for stability for its own sake, do you reckon if there was a, you know, kind of if America took a more relaxed view, you know, not exactly the right word, but do you reckon there would be a little bit less tension between Israel and Palestine? Do you reckon that would kind of, then you could look at the compromises that Israel could make without such a superpower as America backing it and probably even affecting its foreign policy towards Palestine?
So I don't. So look, again, there's lots. I'm not an expert on Islam. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Islam. I'm not going to pretend to understand the rise of radical Islamism. There are lots of good books on this. There are lots of good theories on it. I'm not one of the resources for that. In terms of America, look, America and Israel are allies because of shared values and of shared liberalism, of shared democracy. I don't think that that's got anything to do with, you know, that, remember, Israel was declared on a Friday evening in May 1948. Within an hour of Israel being declared, Egypt's Air Force was bombing Tel Aviv. It's got nothing to do with America. It's a fundamental that they've got, then it was a fundamental, by the way, Egypt was the first country we signed a peace treaty with. So, you know, I think it's complex. I don't think it's about America. I think it's about much more than that. I think that America is the great Satan, we're the little Satan in terms of that radical Islamism, because it's a way of life. We represent, for too many people, America as a country for the last 50 years, and for Israel as a country, represent everything. It's a democracy, it's the rights of women, it's the rights of the LGBT community, it's the rights of minorities, it's all of these things. It's a free press, it's the right to freedom, it's an independent judiciary, it's the right to vote. It's all of these things are anathema to many of these radical dictators. And therefore, why would you want something like that? It's terrifying. What would happen if democracy started to spread through the Middle East in a real way? What would happen if the rights of minorities? What would happen if women had equal rights? What would happen if LGBT had equal rights? All of these things that we have would, I think, be scary to some of them. I think that's also, that's much more of it than it is anything else.
You talk for that. What would you attribute the Shin Bet success to?
Oh wow. Okay. So Shin Bet, for those who don't know, it's an acronym for the Internal Security Services. I'm going to get this the wrong way round. MI5, right? Is internal, MI6 is abroad. So it's the equivalent of the MI5. It's the Israeli MI5. So I'm not an expert on this either, but I'll tell you the following, that in terms of our internal security, where we are successful is based on two fundamentals. One is human intelligence, when 20 years ago the whole world would go back and say electronic intelligence is the only way forward. Actually, Israel kept developing very, very strong human intelligence. And the other one is electronic intelligence, is the ability to hear what's going on phone calls and see what's going on emails and understand patterns and chatter. Very similar patterns than other intelligence services use. Same things that MI5 would use, the same things that other, but it's just been more established in the area. I don't think there's the things that I know. And I said I'm not an expert in it, and it's not my background. I never served in the Shin Bet or anything like that.
Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you a question about freedoms to criticise the state. In modern Western societies, we encourage people to criticise our policies, and we openly invite people who disagree. For example, you might disagree with our position on Israeli settlements, which we've made clear in the UN. I think it's unthinkable for a state to use its power to try and stop people from criticising it. But the Knesset last year passed a law barring foreigners who call for boycotting Israel or Israeli settlements from entering the country. Do you think that that's appropriate behaviour for the state?
Okay. So I want to make a difference. I agree with everything you say in the first part of the sentence, in the first part of that. Criticism, and I think I was really clear to the guy's question over there about criticism. Criticism of Israel is absolutely great. Okay? What the law says, it was a law that was passed, says, and by the way, I believe the Prime Minister said, visiting the country is not a right, it's a privilege. By the way, the Prime Minister was Prime Minister of Britain, not the Prime Minister of Israel. Okay? Visiting a country, not everybody has the right to visit every single country in the world because they want to, if they intend that country harm. If your aim is to destroy my country by encouraging, okay, by doing everything you can to get rid of it, and you are acting on a regular basis...
That's not the aim of criticising Israeli settlements.
First of all, if you criticise Israeli settlements, that law doesn't touch you. If you want to say that you think Israeli settlements are wrong, you can come in and out of that country. And okay, if you want to know the number of people that have been stopped, it's a handful. These are people who spend their entire time trying to act against Israel as a country and trying to stop it. They are encouraging people to have no part. They want to boycott Israel. They want to place sanctions. They want to stop the country from existing. The only people who are covered by this law. I know because I deal with this law specifically on there. Okay, and I'm telling you that if you criticize, even criticize the settlements, even criticize, there is nothing going to stop you going in. Okay, there's an organisation in Britain, a very well-known Jewish organisation called Yachad. It's on the left of the political spectrum in Israel, and they are harshly critical of Israeli settlements. Harshly critical. They think they are all illegal and they should all be taken down. And they act to try and get that done. I will tell you as the Israeli embassy that I disagree with them. I will also tell you I meet with them on a regular basis, and when they want to run a trip to Israel, I help facilitate that trip. So, if you want criticism, fine. If you're going to act to try and bring my country down and say that I believe Hamas is a good organisation and Hamas and terrorism is okay, etc., and praise them, then that's different.
I agree.
Okay? And if you had Lee Rigby, I'll give you a more pride. Lee Rigby, the British soldier that was murdered. If you were to come into this country and say, I want to praise, I think what the murderers of Lee Rigby did was a good thing, they're showing the British military what's going on, and you then said, come into Britain, there'd be an outcry in Britain that you were letting them in. If someone's going to say, killing Israelis is good, come into my country, no one would expect you to do that. I'm going to leave you there to think about it. I don't want you to. Again, I'm not looking for you to disagree with it. I do agree with it. I'm throwing out ideas.
The way it's been phrased to me isn't quite consistent with what you've said.
So I will tell you that I deal with this law on a basis. You just need to know that this is the one law I know backwards and inside out in the last couple of years in every single sense, and I promise you that's how it works. I promise you that's how it works.
Further back, correct, yeah.
On the topic of Israeli settlements, how can you explain the Israeli government forcing Palestinians on a day-to-day basis, forcing Palestinians out of their homes and their lands, homes and lands they have occupied through generations and generations for tens and hundreds of years, and then building illegal Israeli settlements for Israeli citizens?
So look, we'll disagree on this. I don't buy that. I don't accept that narrative. Okay, and we'll disagree, and that's fine. But I don't accept that narrative. I don't accept that we're throwing Palestinians out of their land and we're forcing them out of their home and okay, Israel hasn't built any new settlements in 30 years or something. I don't know the exact number. Okay, I need to get this number for next time. But okay, we're not building any new settlements. We're just not building new settlements. We are expanding the current ones that are there for people, they're having children, they want to grow. There's natural growth and natural expansion, but we're not building new ones. Okay? And we're not expelling Palestinians from off their land. I don't accept that narrative.
International research papers show that the new settlements are being built on a daily basis.
Well, no, there's no new settlements being built. I'm willing to. You won't find me a new settlement that's been built. There's one new settlement that was built, which was a tiny one because another one was taken down. But there's no new settlements being built. We just haven't authorised any new settlements. There are some illegal ones that are being built. The government clears and the Supreme Court rules and forces them to clear. But there's no new ones being built. They are expanding. I accept that. I accept they're expanding, but they're not. Even our harshest critics will accept we're not building new ones. We are expanding other ones. I don't accept the narrative that we're forcing people off their lands. I just don't believe that's what's happening. There aren't Palestinians being forced out their lands in order to do that. Fundamental principle, okay? Come to me afterwards. I'll with the book, and I'll make sure that we give you a book. Okay, on me. I'll find the book. I'll send it to you. Okay, seriously. Okay. What I'm saying is that on that book, what I'm saying is Zionism as a concept says that the Jews have the right to self-determination in their national homeland. Zionism has been used by people and perverted. There was a Zionist terrorist group that was put in prison, a right-wing group. Okay. What you're talking about is tactics. What you're talking about is the way people want to achieve it. If you recognise that the right is you want to have an independent state for the Jewish people, there are some people who take that to extremes. There were some people who will do it in different ways. So I think that we need to be very careful about talking about actions and tactics and people misusing it and what the fundamental belief is. And so that's the fundamental belief.
Isn't the fundamental belief of radical Islamists or Islam in general to have their own state of their own?
Again, I'm not an expert. Radical Islam is not. We're not talking about Islam here. We're talking about radical Islamism, which talks about the caliphate and anybody else being subject. So there's all sorts of. If you agree with radical Islam, then I'm not saying you. If one agrees with radical Islam, then you buy all of the tenets. I'm telling you that the fundamental tenets of Zionism are that the Jewish people have the right to self-determination in their national homeland. That's it. Okay, people are very successfully trying to turn that into Zionism into something that it's not. And I believe that it's again, I'm going into dangerous ground, and I know I'm going into dangerous ground. But I believe that if you trace the history of anti-Semitism and you trace about where it's gone from, it used to be. Anti-Semitism used to be about religion, it used to be about peoplehood, it used to be all sorts. It's gone through many metamorphoses, and I believe that part of anti-Semitism now is a national piece about them as a national and about having self-determination that has gone into that, has morphed into that. I think that's part of what's going on. I'm telling you what Zionism is as a fundamental issue, and then you can argue for days and months and years about what the best form and the best way of achieving that is, and the best way now that exists to run that, and what's the best tactics to use, and that's all the around on the type of Zionism, revisionist Zionism, etc., etc., etc.
We have a question from John that was cut out earlier, but I'll give him a chance to ask now. That's all right.
You've spoken a lot about your democracy and how you've been reaching out to a lot more Arab states now than ever before. So I just wondered, because you you setting a good example to your neighbours? And is there any way you could improve your democracy or the example that you are setting to your neighbours to try and encourage them to...
Look, it's a good question. It's also, I think it's a philosophical question. It's a moral question. I don't know that it's our job to impose on our neighbours the way they should live their life. I believe that democracy is the best way forward. It's the way that we've chosen as a country to live. It's the way we want to live. It doesn't mean it's necessary that I need to... by the way, if I believe it's right for me, I also believe it's right for everybody else. I don't know you're wrong for that, by the way. But it's not my job to impose that on other people. It's my job to worry about my democracy and to do that. It's in my interest that there should be other democracies, because generally speaking, you get less conflict between two democracies than you do between democracies and theocracies and democracies and other forms. Connected to the Israeli security system. Every time there's a rocket attack from Gaza into Israel in the next little while, my phone's going to beep. In the time we've been in here, in the last, it's been about 45 rockets in the time that we've been in here. Okay? Every time there's going to be one, it'll beep. It might not beep again now that I've done this. But it's just, I think it's important just so you understand the life that's going on at the moment, because it's likely to develop into a bigger story. There's another question.
Going back to the settlements in the West Bank, I assume you don't think that is illegal, so I just wanted to know if you could expand on why you don't think it's illegal, considering that people have said that it's a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention, settling on occupied land.
Okay, so the reason that we don't think it's illegal all comes down to one simple question. Who is the land occupied from? Okay? Now I know this is going to seem very obvious, so who's the land, I'll ask the question, who's the land occupied from?
Palestinians.
Which Palestinians? The Palestinians have never had independence there under international law.
Okay.
In 1948, again, I'm going to give you the history and I'm going to tell you where we come from. Okay, for some reason my phone is not making noises now, that's just annoying because there was an attack just there, but anyway, it buzzes on my watch. I'll give it okay? I'll tell you why. 1947, okay, that's an attack. Okay, another one. Sorry. In 1947, the United Nations partitioned the land. The whole area was there, they partitioned it into 2 states. Okay, the Jews accepted it, the Arab states didn't, it was voted on by the United Nations. The area that you would think about, you get the idea. I'm going to turn it off because it's disturbing, okay? You get the idea of what's going on as we're talking. And for the vast majority of those, most people have 15 seconds to find a shelter before a rocket comes down. In 1947, they divided the area. Okay, the Jews accepted it, the Arabs didn't accept it. There then came the 1940 until 1949, the War of Independence. At the end of the War of Independence, Jordan occupied or took the West Bank, and Egypt took the Gaza Strip. In 1967, there was a war. Israel took the West Bank from Jordan and took the Gaza Strip from Egypt. Between 1948 and 1967, no one called for a Palestinian state in those areas. There was no call for it anywhere. Be very clear. Okay? So that was that's the first thing we need to remember. So 1967, and then in 1918, I remember the exact, in the 1980s, Jordan announced they've got no further claim to the West Bank. So I will argue it's a disputed territory, but in order to be occupied, you have to occupy it from someone. And the argument from the State of Israel is there's no one that it's occupied from. It's disputed and we haven't annexed it. We don't claim it as ours. But we also say it doesn't currently belong to anybody else, and we're willing to negotiate over that land as to where it goes. That's our argument. Okay, and I will be for openness and honesty, which will be not many other people in the world accept that argument. Okay? But we have very good lawyers and international jurists, and they believe that argument is legally holds water. Okay? It's an interesting debate to have. I don't want to get into that debate because we'll go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, but that's the Israeli argument, that it's not occupied from anybody and these are not stopping it. Okay?
Where does all the money given to the Palestinian Authority go?
Well, okay, so here's some great statistics for you, in case you didn't know this. The Palestinian Authority receives billions of dollars in aid. The Palestinian Authority is one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. They also last year gave $350 million to terrorist families. Okay, I'll take one more question after this. Okay, they give $350 million to terrorist families. If you are a Palestinian and you're sitting in an Israeli jail because you stole a car or you raped someone or you did whatever else you did, you were a petty criminal, okay? Then the Palestinian Authority says, oh dear, and you're in prison. If, as a Palestinian, you murder an Israeli or any other person that you happen to murder for nationalist reasons, and you go to an Israeli prison, the Palestinian Authority pays you and your family a stipend for the rest of your life. If you are 25 years old, so if you are in the region of 25 to 30 years old, and you live to the age of about 60, and we know these numbers, you will get paid over $1 million in your lifetime by the Palestinian Authority if you kill an Israeli. Okay, $350 million last year were paid out by the Palestinian Authority to families of terrorists who killed Israelis. There was unfortunately, a British student who was a non-Jewish British student, a woman called Hannah Bladen, who was murdered in a terrorist attack. The person that killed her is receiving a stipend from the Palestinian Authority for carrying out a heroic terrorist attack. So, and the Palestinian Authority accept they pay them. They'll give you different reasons why they do it, but the second biggest line item on their budget is $350 million to families and people who carry out terrorist attacks.
Okay, final question, last chance.
What do you think the future situation on the Golan Heights will be?
Wow. Okay, so the Golan Heights is another area which we didn't talk about, which was taken from Syria in 1967. The Golan Heights is now the border with Syria. Look, I think that as far as we can see now, the Golan Heights is going to stay as part of Israel. We annexed it in 1981. I don't want to think about what would have happened if the Golan Heights would have been part of Syrian territory during the recent, call it a civil war, but it's anything but civil, war that took place. Imagine having all of those terror organizations and all of those people right next to Israeli communities and the Sea of Galilee and everything else. So I do not see the Golan Heights going anywhere else. There's no regime in Syria. There's no one to talk to. There's no anything there. So I don't see any change in the Syrian situation. I want to finish, if I can, with the following. I feel I've talked lots of negative and doom and gloom and played you lots of rocket attacks. Okay, you see from the way I watch that they are just not stopping. Okay? I want to say the following. Even though by the time I wake up tomorrow morning, it might be much, much better and this might have fallen over overnight, or it might get much, much worse and we might end up in a serious conflict and escalation in there, which I, for obvious reasons, pray we don't. I'm still very positive about the future. And I'm positive about the future for the things that I've kind of touched upon and talked upon earlier. Because I believe that people want to live positively. I believe that people do want a better life. I believe that people do, from both sides. And again, side is even a pejorative term about sides. From both Palestinians and Israelis and others, they want a better life for their children. I look at what Israel has developed. You know, one in 6 prescriptions on the NHS, here's a useless statistic for 1 in 6 prescriptions on the NHS is fulfilled by an Israeli company. If you have a mobile phone, the technology in it is produced by Israel. If you have an Intel computer, the technology is produced by Israel. If you have used Facebook, if you use instant messenger technology was produced by Israel. Facebook has an R&D center, Google has its R&D center. All of these things are taking place in Israel. So, in that sense, we're having a huge impact on people's lives. There's no reason that other people in the region couldn't also, if we can produce that, there's no reason that anybody else can't as well if they can put their energies into it. And I believe that idea and that vision of a better life is one that most people want. And therefore, that's why I'm hopeful. I said at the beginning, I've got a wife and 2 kids. I've got a little 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, 5.5-year-old. Both boys. When we get to 18, they will both serve in the army. Okay, every Israeli at the age of 18 serves in the army, boys and girls. Okay? I genuinely have sleepless nights, okay, about my boys going into the army. They're 5 and 3. It's 13 to 15 years away. I have sleepless nights about it. When I talk about the fact we might be going into a conflict, all I think about is that boys from both sides, by the way, from both sides are going to end up going into a conflict. No one can want that. I have more to gain from peace than any other person in this room. I promise you. Because it's my 2 boys, who obviously are the most precious thing in the world to me. I don't want them serving in the army. Not because I'm not proud of my country, I'm incredibly proud of my country, but because I don't want them to face the dangers that they're going to face, and I don't want them to have to do the things that they might have to do by serving in the army. Because it's not good for anybody. It might be necessary, it might be essential, but it's not good. And therefore, I have more to gain than any other person in this room from peace. And I understand why it's so powerful and why it's so important. And it's because of that that I'm hopeful. And yes, there are real challenges. But at some point, we'll resolve it. And at some point, we'll come to a peaceful agreement. And if you think about this, you're going to say, he's mad. Okay? But if you think about all the great conflicts that were going on for years, the island question, South Africa, all of these different places, everybody said they were unsolvable until the day they were solved. So yeah, it might be unsolvable until the day we solve it. And we will solve it because it's in the interest of everybody. And I just want to finish by apologising for talking too much. And thank you for listening and for asking tough questions and challenging me. And thank you very much. They're gonna make me leave now without me staying behind and talking. But please give your name and address to him, and I will make sure that when we get back to London, if you get a packet like that in the next couple of days, it's the book I promised you about Zionism. Huh? No, you might have to, but I'll pay the postage. You might have to go down to the post box and collect it. But I promise you I will send it to you. I will make sure you get it and read it. It's a thick book. It's a great book. And thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much.